Thank you, Aaron. So when you see it go red, then we're live. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So now you hopefully can see me, and in a moment you will see Professor Caroline Boudoux, who has literally written the book on this topic. So she has given you some very nice lectures on the use of fiber optics and biomedical optics and imaging. And she's going to give a quick reminder of what she talked about for the first few minutes, and then we'll get stuck into the questions. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much. Welcome to this Q&A, and thank you for the invite, Martin and Aaron. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to see the extent of the biomedical optics community. With I see people from all over the world asking questions and listening, so it makes me very happy. I'd like to go back quickly. Go back quickly to some topics that we covered earlier this week. So I was asked to talk about optical fibers in the context of endoscopy. I think I'm going to move on to the next slide and remind everyone of this conflict of interest that I feel that I need to disclose. So I'm wearing a few hats. I'm the head of a lab at Polytechnique Montreal, where we do research not only on fiber optics, but also on the full instruments going to the clinics. So we have our own spectrum there of new instruments and new clinical projects. And some patents from that lab, from my lab, were licensed to Castor Optics, which was created with the goal of commercializing a new family of dedicated fiber optics couplers for biomedical applications. But now it turns out we're branching out into more than just biomedical optics, as our new technology also has applications in LiDAR, for example, or in sensing in a general term. Castor is a strategic partners of Thor Labs. So unfortunately, I do not own any part of Thor Labs, but we are in this close partnership. We manufacture couplers in Montreal, and they are distributed worldwide by Thor Labs. And this is one of the ways that I found being able to manage both a lab and a company, is that at a company we only do the D part of R&D, although we have some research as well, but we don't have to do all the paperwork or most of the paperwork associated with invoicing, billing, and collecting. And so through this strategic partnership, this eases a lot on the business side. And of course, Thor Labs is a wonderful partner to have. So that's the end. And feel free to ask questions about entrepreneurship, because I believe if you're doing research in high tech, this will come up at one point in your career: how to license, how to exploit it yourself, and what are the possible ways to doing so. Aaron, next slide, please. So we talked about fiber optics, and what are fiber optics? Really, these are thin fibers made of a polymer, and the important thing is that there's a region called the core where the light is being guided that has a higher index of refraction than the surroundings. And the reason I stress that is that this picture is actually not, and now you have the insider information, is not a picture of fiber optics. It was made for a TED Talk, and it's a collection of fishing wires, right? So these are fibers, these are made of polymer, and their index is greater than air, so they can conduct light. But of course, if you want to use fiber optics to conduct light in a very efficient manner over distance, then you need to have a second zone called a cladding, which has a lower index of refraction. Otherwise, wherever you touch, be it with your finger or with a dust, you would have light leaking out. So you really want to have this cladding and then this buffering as we described. And the goal in this community is to do imaging with fiber optics, but also continue to try to get better resolution, better pixel density, better field of view, faster imaging, so going in through 3D and 4D, seeing under the surface, increasing the specificity, and eventually allowing for theranostics. So we can't, of course, say we're going to tackle all these objectives at once, but this is always the goal in our design. Next, please. So as you now know, fiber optics, the guiding principle is total internal reflection. And if you work through the very simple geometry using Snell's laws, the refraction of the beam coming from air into the fiber, that defines a maximum angle from the critical angle for total internal reflection. You want to be above this critical angle, and that defines a maximum entrance angle and also a maximum excidence angle, and this is defined as for any optical system as the numerical aperture. Next, please. So we covered very roughly two types of fibers, but I think it's interesting because the field of biomedical optics has historically been also divided between low throughput, very highly gated, coherent imaging, where you exploit the phase and spatial coherence and temporal coherence to get exquisite images of really, really high resolution, but really, really low signal to noise ratio. And the other part of biomedical imaging that uses tons of photons, diffuse optics, is the same divide with the fiber optic mode. With the multimode fiber, you have a high throughput. Each mode has its own propagation vector, velocity and phase. And so they get scrambled, and this is a very, very hot topic currently, is trying to divide and recuperate individual modes through photonic lanterns. And I know my lab and my company are both involved in this new generation. But for now, multimode fiber can be seen as essentially photon highways, typically used for coherent imaging, but this will change in the coming months and in the coming years. Next, please. And of course, well, I had to put in my favorite. So there's tons of geometries. You can have photonic crystals, you can have polarization maintaining fibers, you can have 2 cores, 3 cores, N cores. We love to play with the double clad fiber, where for imaging, we both have the benefit from single mode illumination. We can also do single mode detection. And in addition, we collect all those photons from the inner cladding to increase the SNR of our images and to make multimodal imaging. Next, please. Of course, we need to understand fiber optics as a physical instrument that has limits. So the absorption is typically negligible. However, the dispersion is a problem, and it doesn't have to be just for pulsed light, as is shown in this picture here. Dispersion has an effect whenever you have more than one mode, more than one polarization, more than one wavelength, and when you have even for a fundamental mode, when the mode is distributed over part of the core and part of the cladding, every time the index of refraction changes, you have a change in velocity, and that will spread your beam. Next, please. And so in OCT, the dispersion, because OCT uses broadband light, so many wavelengths, a single mode fiber, but also a single mode waveguide. So the core and the cladding have different indices of refraction. The effect of dispersion is that in interferometry, all wavelengths are not undergo a different delay, and that will blur your resolution. This is an image of a very famous sample. It is not Professor Fujimoto's eye. I think the cucumber is the second most used sample in OCT after the eye of the inventor of OCT, which was on on very many papers at the beginning. But here, the cucumber, if you don't pay attention to dispersion, you will have blurrier images than what your resolution should be in theory, given the bandwidth of your laser. And so you can apply both numerical and hardware approaches to solving dispersion. And of course, I'm a hardware person, so I will always argue for first trying to find a hardware solution in the first order, and then you correct numerically in the second order. But if you understand the physics of it, then you can find clever ways to go about it. Next, please. Dispersion affects anything that is broadband. That includes ultra-short pulses required for multiphoton microscopy. And in this case, you don't lose so much the resolution, but you lose the power of your signal. You need your beam to be rather intense at the focus to be able to generate those nonlinear events that you base your imaging on. And so if you don't pay attention to dispersion, you let your pulse broaden and be not being as tight at the focus as it should be, then you lose your signal to noise. And as soon as you compress the beam, so you apply an opposite dispersion, so you have a beam, you have light that is dispersed with the color in the wrong order, and as it goes through your system, it recompresses the pulse, and you get back to fantastic images. Next, please. Now, being a dielectric medium, the fiber optics also generate its own signal. And as you propagate through meters of fiber optics, you can generate from absorption of shorter wavelength autofluorescence. This is typically seen under 500 nanometers. Not only that, but if you use very short wavelength, you can create this solarization effect, and the fiber eventually over the months and over the years becomes opaque. So from the absorption side, you have to watch out for that. But from the scattering side, you also have Raman scattering. And so it becomes a huge challenge when using fiber optics for Raman imaging. It can be done, but as my colleague Frédéric Leblanc at Polytechnique Montreal and his group have done, you need to consider the fiber as a source of noise, the ambient light, and to remove everything until you can recover those peaks, those Raman peaks that you were looking at in the first place. Next, please. So we also briefly talked about different ways to perform scanning. So of course, the very first endoscopes were and are still being done with fiber bundles. These are thousands of fibers that are put together, assembled together into a millimeter or 2 millimeter size instrument, up to 4 millimeter for nasal passage. And you get a few thousands of pixels. Of course, we're really, really far from the megapixel that even the cheapest cameras and cell phones have nowadays. But a couple of thousands of images is a very good start, and you can use them to do endoscopy, but also has been shown to do confocal microendoscopy providing very good images through very small endoscopes. Now, the next generation involves scanning if you only have one fiber. So you can scan it mechanically with piezos, with MEMS. Next slide shows that you can also do the scanning using spectral encoding. Can we get to the next slide, please, Aaron? Thank you so much. And so this was part of my PhD work, where we developed a wavelength swept laser, both for OCT and for spectral scanning. So here, in a passive way, we put a grating at the tip of a fiber. So fiber with a couple of grain lenses and spacers and a grating. And so as the wavelength in the source changes, so does the orientation of the beam, and you obtain scanning on the sample. And looking at that, once we had worked during my PhD on the source, and Vera Yellen and Dong-Kyung Kang had worked on the grating at the tip, I looked at this whole system and I said, what if we could change the fiber and modify the fiber as well? Not only use fiber optics developed for telecoms, but using fiber optics that we're going to dedicate to their design to biomedical applications. And this is where the double clad fiber coupler emerged. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the advantage of using specialty fibers that you can design it for whatever your purpose is. And here we wanted to have single mode illumination to have diffraction limited spot at the focus. We wanted to be able to collect from the single mode to get the phase information, but also collect from the inner cladding to get a high throughput, high intensity image. And because we collect both channels at the same time, we can combine them. So here from A, which is the single mode channel that still has the phase, we can compare it to a reference arm and obtain the depth, the distance from the interferometric measurement. And we combine that with the high intensity speckle-free image to get a nice 3D image from a single fiber optics. Here, the scanning was done with spectral encoding, but it could have been done with a piezo or MEMS-based scanner. Next, please. And so that led to technology transfer to Castor and to Thorlabs, and very rapidly the technology was picked up by groups around the world. Now I say groups around the world, of course I show an image of a group in Canada, so my own country, but because it's in Vancouver, it's 5 kilometers away from Quebec, so it almost feels international. In fact, if you're in Montreal, the first time you go to Vancouver, your reflex, because it's such a long flight, is to grab your passport, but it's still the same country. The same between Boston and Seattle, I presume. So here, the double clad was used to combine OCT in brown in the lungs, in vivo imaging, with autofluorescence. So no injection of fluorophore, just exploiting fluorescence from the body. And here, I apologize, it's going to sound like a pitch for my company, but autofluorescence being very weak, the only way to collect it is to have a device that has exquisite sensitivity. And this is why we keep redesigning our couplers at Castor. So Castor is never going to be a company about high volume, low price. We're a company for where every photon counts, and so or have expensive components, but that are getting close to the theoretical limit. So when the theoretical limit is 100%, some couplers we manage to go and get 90% of the signal being transferred and being collected. So this is the niche of the company, and some people have questions about entrepreneurship. So I wanted to say, I think one of the important parts is to find your niche, find your mission, and that sounds, if you're not in the business side, these sounds like empty words, but truly finding what your purpose is that defines you as a company, and you keep the focus then on this. So again, we're probably not going to go do high volumes, low cost, but sometimes we hit a design win where that could be used in the telecom, and in which case we transfer the design to Thorlabs, who does the very high volume manufacturing. That allows Castor to focus on the very intricate design, really, really high throughput, and the complicated forms, complicated shapes. Next, please, before I turn this introduction into a sales pitch. In our lab, we showed that we can do multimodal OCT. One first way is to combine it with hyperspectral imaging. So here we add the true color to OCT. So that would be the equivalent in the same probe of having OCT and white light endoscopy. That's very useful because OCT probes, as you know, can be made to being very, very small. Next, please. And here we're going the other route, where this was a video in the presentation. I apologize, this is static here, but essentially we're using the double clad fiber to have imaging OCT through the core, and we use the inner cladding to send a therapy laser. Here we show that we achieve coagulation and that we can monitor using speckle dynamics and correlation of images, so we can do it live, show the heat wave propagating, and decide when to stop a treatment, for example, based on the speckle motion, the motion of the scatterer changing the speckle pattern. Next, please. And I wanted to put this slide again because I realized for some reason I had put tons of typos in the names of my students, and the students are really the star of this entire set of lecture series. So I wanted to fix the typos and acknowledge the work from my group, the current members, the past members, and also collaborators all over the world who are game to try sometimes very, very first and crude versions of the instruments that we develop in the lab. And I'd like to go to the next slide. Professor Lee, he talked about the book. It just occurred to me yesterday, and I'm sorry I've been so slow with this, but it just occurred to me that I can do my part as well for COVID. So for a limited time, I've lowered the price of the book on Blurb, if for anyone would be interested, in an attempt to compensate for the shipping costs. So typically the books are ordered at the bookstore, and so shipping is paid only once and distributed over many books by the bookstore. And it is, if as a student you acquire books individually, you pay for the shipping. And so I just recently lowered the price of the books for students to try to do my part for COVID. We are documenting this entrepreneurial journey through Facebook with my alias Prof Boudoux, and I hope this could be one of the ways that we stay in touch after this presentation.
Okay, Caroline, thank you for that. That's a fantastic roundup. So I'm going to go straight to the first question. I don't know if the guys can put up slide 13 from lecture 1.
Actually, I have it, so I'm gonna try this now.
Okay.
Yep. This is it. So again, let me see if I can do it. Here we go. Do you see it now?
Yeah, very good. So the question is, how can we calculate the 1/E beam radius of the coherent light being propagated from a single mode fiber at a certain distance?
So the mode field diameter, this is funny because I had removed some equations to make the slides lighter. So I just removed, they were in hiding and now they're in plain view. So to calculate the mode field diameter, you use the Marcuse formula. So I can either email this slide to you, or you have it there, or you can just Google it. So Marcuse, M-A-R-C-A-U-S-E. The mode field diameter is essentially a function of the geometrical diameter as well as the V parameter. So you have it here, but typically it's the MFD that you will get in the specs of a fiber. Once it gets out of the fiber, it becomes Gaussian optics. So you can use ABCD matrices, or you can just calculate the propagation of a Gaussian beam. You can also do it geometrically. So sometimes you don't need as much accuracy. So you can just base it on the numerical aperture of the fiber. It doesn't work for very close field, but for far field, go with the numerical aperture. And so in the paraxial approximation, you can just use the formula for NA, and that will give you the diameter over a distance. So this is useful, for example, if you're trying to calculate the diameter of a collimated beam after you put a lens right after your fiber. But this is standard geometrical optics calculation. That would be my answer. I hope this is what you were looking for.
Yeah, very good. Meng Li in Lund is asking, would optical fiber completely replace the metal coaxial cable in the future, even for the transfer of energy? And has some other questions. So on lecture 3, wants to know, fiber optics probe for tumor margin detector, what are the red and blue lines? So I guess start with the first question.
The first question, it's many people are working on that. So to me, it's always a question of efficiency. Whenever you have a transfer from electrical energy to optical energy, you need to look at efficiency, and you have losses. So if you have cases where you don't have this much energy being transferred, then it's reasonable to assume that it can replace it. But if you are working with, it's just a budget of energy. If your loss in transfer both ways is not worth it, then it's not going to happen. But in some cases, when you can spare the losses, then it could replace. So I don't think it will entirely replace, but in some areas it could. But you always, this is something we don't emphasize enough in physics, right? We see equation, and we can see energy being transferred from electricity to optics and back to electricity, and we always fail to account for the efficiency in the transfer, and this is going to be the bottleneck. So in some areas where you can when you can excuse the loss, sure. But if we start being inefficient in so many areas, then the account, the overall bilan, the profit and loss in terms of energy doesn't make sense. So my prediction is that it will not entirely replace it, but in some areas it could.
Yeah.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Martin?
Well, I think that they were asking a very general question, like, large scale energy transfer, and I guess that's a curious thing. So how efficient are fiber optics? And I guess maybe the issue is that fiber optics are not going to be the problem. The efficiency of converting light back into electrical energy is going to be a much bigger problem, isn't it?
Yeah. This is where I see. So I don't see the fiber as being the problem, although for very high powers, then you could have some issues. But I don't see the fiber being the problem, but it's the conversion on either end of the fiber from one mode to the other and back. And I don't think you reach 50%. So I think, to me, the loss is prohibitive. But in some areas, for example, if you needed to feed an underwater optical amplifier, then it makes sense, because having only one cable going underwater, then that totally makes sense to do it optically. But in all areas of life, I don't think so.
Okay, so the red and blue lines in lecture 3, I guess if the guys can put up fiber optics probe for tumor margin detection slide.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I have it. Unfortunately, I didn't share my slides. I'm the bad. Oh yeah. So I know what they are, but I'm gonna have to refer to the book. I'm sorry, I didn't put the caption here. Give me. So essentially, the red and the blue, one was for normal tissue, and one was for the tumor. So this is the red and the blue. But I don't, by heart, I don't recall which is which. So I'm gonna try to find it live, and that should take a few. There it is. The red is the tumor tissue, and the blue is the normal tissue.
Okay,
that's an easy question.
Yeah, so the difference between them does not look too significant. So how did you ensure the difference in measurement are due to cancer cells and not noise?
But so it's not. It doesn't seem significant, but in the Raman world, they have enough bands, so they're working really hard to, in terms of data processing, to find algorithms. But in the papers they publish, they achieve a pretty high sensitivity and specificity. So it's not as striking as you would like, but it seems to be enough for them to make some sort of a call.
Truly Chatterjee, who I know is in Irvine, asks, could you speak about your experiences with leading a lab and being a co-president and co-founder of a company? For example, what were your biggest challenges and your greatest rewards?
Oh God, I can talk about challenges for hours. Let me make an analogy, because the first time I heard it, I wasn't convinced, and that now that I'm in the middle of it, it's totally clear. So before I had kids or a kid, before I become a mom, I was told that by someone who had both a career and a family, that the success in having both is to marry well, to be surrounded by people, not marry well in terms of money, but marry well in terms of people who are supportive of you doing both. And I'm going to say the key to having both a lab and a company is to surround yourself with fantastic people. So the star, again, of this entire journey are my students in the lab who are doing a really, really good job at understanding why we're doing this. So you also need to become more articulate about why you're doing this. And on the company side, you also need to surround yourself with people who share the same values, who understand why you're doing this and who you are at the core. I'm an academic at the core. My business partner, Nicolas Godbout, also a professor, is an academic to the core. And so it didn't make sense if we partnered up with venture cap who were only money people. So our partners are two of the greatest scientists that I've ever known. Alex Cable has more papers. The founder and owner of Thor Labs has more papers than I will ever have. And the other business person who also invested in Castor is a polymath. He's a truly Renaissance man who was a faculty before being a business person. And so on the business side, it works because our business partners understand that our goal is to be scientists and remain scientists and keep producing new knowledge and publishing. And publishing means having students who need to publish before we go to market with a product. And on the student body side, it also means that the students understand that why you're doing this. And in our case, the reason we started Castor was to accelerate the transition from a lab idea to the clinics. And in our case, it happened within a year and a half. Within a year and a half of saying, that's it, we're looking for someone to commercialize this. A year and a half later, it was used by a different group in a human study, in vivo. In vivo, both before and after, so really good in vivo. And so that was really, really quick. So I think defining your core values and finding people who share those values both in the company and in the lab was key. And I think the most rewarding part is probably that, is having found what our core values are and what's the mission and why we're doing things. The challenges are plenty. And if I had known about the challenges before doing this, starting the lab and starting the company while keeping the lab, I would never, ever have done it. So I'm gonna stay quiet about the challenges. Certainly, you need a huge amount of naivete to try to do this. The same with a book. When I started writing a book, I talked to a colleague who's a little more senior than me, and she said, "Don't do it, because it's such a crazy endeavor." She says, "Just don't do it. A book is for old people." And maybe you see me as an old dinosaur, but 10 years ago when I started writing the book, I wasn't that old and I didn't have this many white hair. And so what I decided to do is just to stop talking to people about the book. And I because the first person I talked to, she said, just don't do it. It's so crazy and it's going to take so much time. Leave a retired person, leave an older person. But we needed a book and I wanted to write a book. And so I decided not to talk to other people so they would not discourage me. And only once the book was ready, then I talked to people about it. And I remember another faculty to whom I said, hey, I'm writing a book. And he rolled his eyes saying, another person who's going to show me a 2-page, you know, and I actually gave him the book. And he's like, oh, okay, you're actually writing a book. So same with the company. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to say too much because I don't want to be discouraging. I think you're learning about the challenges as you go. But you need to be humble about what it is you don't know. And what's very typical of a PhD in engineering and a PhD in physics is that we think we can do it all. And we sort of snub a little bit the other specialties. Oh, marketing, I can do this. Oh, accounting, I can do this. Oh, blah, human resources, I can do this. And very quickly you realize that you could, but there are some people whose career it is to do marketing and human resources and finances. So you do it the first year because you need to learn about it, right? You cannot be a president and be clueless about what people are doing. So you do it the first year, but very rapidly you need to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you about human resources and funding and finances and what did I say, marketing. Yeah. So I think we are accompanied by the best marketing team in optics, right? So Thorlabs does our marketing. I mean, this right, hands off. But challenges are plenty, but I think the biggest challenge is that you don't know what you don't know. And so you need to be very humble, very open to finding people who can teach you. And I watch Dragon Dens a lot. I think you have a Dragon's Den in you have in French it's called differently, Dragon's Den, Shark Tank, that sort of. And once I say this, you will probably notice a common thread when people do not invest is when you have an entrepreneur who does not listen. So you need to have big ears. I was born with them and I use them every day. You need to be hungry for the opinion of others, unless they tell you, don't do it, it's a bad idea. But you need to listen to opinions. You need to be willing to learn. And I think that has been the greatest strength. Yeah, so I didn't mention that many challenges, but Martin, you probably have a few things to say about that as well.
And I've had a few. Actually, my first endeavor with Oxford Optronics, I remember an Indian lady, lovely Indian lady, working for the UK Department for Trade and Industry, advising us that you need to have an unreasonable willingness to succeed, which I always look back at and think, how cool was that? Because I didn't realize at the time, but you know, if you thought carefully and you understood what you were getting into, as you said, you probably wouldn't do it, right? You have to be prepared to keep going. You know, sometimes when all around you is kind of saying, well, you know, maybe you shouldn't, maybe you should let this go, you know. But you do have to be careful. You know, you can't just wipe out your life on something that doesn't make sense. So you also need that thing, and it's much more rare than we think. The human brain, it's actually very interesting studies recently by Shane O'Mara and other people showing that telling people the facts. In fact, you can see this all over the media. Telling people the facts does not change their mind, even if the facts contradict absolutely their position. They will still keep going in that direction. So, you know, if you want to be an entrepreneur, you don't want to be that person. You do not want to be one of the sheep, and you do not want to be one of the, you know, who will be just led by anybody. You also do not want to be one of these people who you've got your opinion, and no matter how the facts or the data come in front of you, you will keep going in that direction. If you are like that, you will not succeed. You have to be able to say, okay, that's not working. That's not what the clinician really wanted. That's not answering the question they wanted. I've got to change what I'm doing. It doesn't matter that my technology does that really well, and I get really pretty pictures. If it doesn't change the direction or change the outcome for the patient, you've got to stop and recalibrate and go after what it is they really want. So unless you're willing to listen, I think that's, as you said, big ears, right?
Big ears, and also something we tend to forget, right? We're in the lab, we're super quantitative, and we get to the company, and you need an original intuition. So they want to see this. I have this intuition that this product can work or is useful. The minute you start selling your product, the intuition is out the window and you look at numbers. And you need to be willing to kill a product if it doesn't sell, even though it's your baby that you created in a lab with like blood, sweat, and tears. On the business side, it does not matter. If it does not sell, it's just noise for your company. And so you need to listen to numbers. So that's a different, you can have a passion in the lab, a passion for science. You can, the lab is very forgiving in that sense. But in a company, you need to listen to numbers, you need to listen to customers, and you need to listen to paying customers. Many people would say, oh, your company is great, your product is great. Listen to the people who actually, you know, have exchanged money for your goods. And those are the numbers that you need to listen. So it's a different mindset, but it's also, it's incredibly humbling, of course, and it has influenced my teaching as well. If you spend your entire career in a university lab, people say, oh, it's so hard to do research. This is not real life. This is so cozy compared to anything real life. And so that's true. Like university, it's very cozy. It's very forgiving. The company is not. And at the end of the day, if you didn't sell products, you cannot pay your employees and you don't have a business. So a business starts when you have families to support, and that gets really, really real. So lab is very forgiving, the company is not, and so you need to look at your numbers and you need to look at facts, but willing to learn from facts and willing to be contradicted by numbers.
Yeah, well, there's some other good advice. If you want good employees, employ people with mortgages and families to support, because they know they've got to, you know, you got to get the job done, and keep focused on getting the job done. So, you know, your willingness to succeed then is so much better. You mentioned that your PhD was on this swept source laser, and I wonder if I can connect that to this conversation, because it occurred to me maybe that's how you started this relationship with Thorlabs, and actually, as happens in a lot of companies, you know, maybe that's what you started out the idea with, and then actually you end up selling something quite different, or producing something quite different.
No, this is a complete different start with Thorlabs. Again, being young and naive. Well, my strengths are talking and listening one-on-one, but I was terrible in a lecture hall, and it's probably too much honesty, but I was an even more terrible going to a conference that has, you know, speakers from 8 in the morning to 8 at night. And so my tip when I go to a very large conference is to take breaks at the trade show. And very early on, I realized that and this probably a good piece of advice, even if you only do academia. I hadn't realized until my very first trade show that the salespeople that you see at the booth are not salespeople by trade. They are people with technical degrees, masters and PhD, and if you're lucky, they also are, because the field is not that big. And so the people who are at the trade shows, unless you talk with a huge company, they are the people who develop the technology. And so if you want to be aware of the latest product, you can listen to a talk, but you can also go have a one-on-one conversation with a board scientist at their booth within the floor, the trade show space. And so I had many of those conversations, and I bumped into Alex Cable, who was not wearing his name tag, I had no idea who he was. Even if he had had a name tag, I was a second-year grad student, no idea who even Thorlabs was. Like, it's for, except for the lab snacks, right? So I knew about the company, but I didn't know how their effort to always seek out new technology. And we started having a really cool conversation because I didn't know then, but he was starting his line of imaging. That was way before he started having OCT scanners and confocal microscopes. And we had a very interesting conversation about confocal microscopy. And something that I still remember to this day, and then I tell the Castor staff when they go to trade show, Alex never tried to sell me anything. He was just interested, genuinely interested in the science. Science should be the fil conducteur. Science should be the narrative always. So we had the science discussion, and I knew every year that if I wanted to have a really good scientific discussion with someone, I should go to the floor and find this guy, Alex Cable. And eventually he was wearing his name tag and I saw he was the founder. But we always, very early on in my grad career, I started having scientific conversations with him. And so this connection, and of course, eventually we start, you get to second year, third year grad students, you make your own purchases, you notice that, Thorlabs is a viable company to buy your parts, and so are many. I'm not trying to make a sales pitch, but I'm just saying in terms of my introduction to Thorlabs, I got to have scientific discussions with people from that company and many others about the limitation of the technology. And if you're doing state-of-the-art research, you need to know what's the fastest detector, and so you get to talk with people at the booth about the technology, and you learn a lot that way. But my relationship started with a conversation that he remembered and I remembered that we kept going twice a year, and about what's new in the field and what's exciting in the technology.
Yeah, I guess you need to know what questions to ask as well, because they're selling a product and they're telling you about the good parts. You need to ask, well, what is the downside of this technology? Why aren't people using this in this field? And those kind of questions. I think you learn a lot from that, because they know the answer, but they don't volunteer it necessarily because it's.
But sometimes I wasn't even asking questions. A good salesperson will listen to you. I think when you go to trade show, it's not as much as about creating leads, but also gathering info. So they're asking you a lot about what it is you're doing. They want to know where the field is going. Mm-hmm. So it's both it's exchange of information. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess if you can tell them, yes, tell them what you're doing, and they can advise you, well, this practically is the right thing for you to do that. And quite often they'll also say, well, actually, you don't want our product, you want that one. What we do doesn't really suit your needs, and they will know who is doing that typically. Hempus is from Lund is asking us about academia and industry. I think we've covered that reasonably well, so I'm going to move on unless you have something else to add to that. Dominic Galvez is asking about tech transfer experience process with Thorlabs. I guess you covered that quite a bit, but let's see what she says. Thorlabs now have their own commercial version of the custom fiber tapering setup. Do you think a device like that would ever become, or, well, I don't know if she means did you think, or do you think would ever become a commercial product?
So you're referring to the Vitron, and we know this really well. So we have the relationship we have with Thorlabs is on an R&D level. So the curtains are lifted very high for both companies to share info. So we learn a lot from that machine, and we also provide insight from the custom design that we have. And so far, it's all about making the coupler available to as many people as we can. Eventually, the Vitron will catch up and be able to produce a double clad fiber couplers. But one thing that I should also notice is that all the fiber that we use, most of it is proprietary. So even if you have a fusion tapering system at home, you need to have our fiber to make the couplers. But what's really important as a company is that you don't want to be in 20 years, we don't want to be known for double clad fiber couplers. In 2 years, we'll be known for multimode circulators that we're launching. And in 5 years, we'll be known for the photonic lanterns. And as we're developing new and more complicated and intricate systems, we'll still be ahead. So this I don't see this as a threat, but it's really good that Thorlabs has so much interest in the fiber industry by acquiring Vitrans, for example, because by lifting the curtains, both companies share info, and it's the wealth of information is incredible. So it's benefiting a small company like Castor.
Yeah, I think lots of room for cooperation, and people forget that, you know, having other products in a similar vein, you know, at a particular source does help, because more people will go. People will think, okay, well, that's where I go for this sort of thing, and it'll be either that, might be that company or another company. It's a bit like going to a science park, and you'll have lots of companies with the same kind of background, or and you know, they're in competition, but they're also in a kind of synergistic ecosystem, let's say. Ben Moon from Rochester wants to know, what are some of the design considerations to keep in mind when deciding which dispersion compensation method to employ for OCT? Can you comment on the trade-offs between hardware and software compensation?
I don't see them as competing. I think you need to make sure your hardware, my philosophy, but then other people would see it differently. But my philosophy is to try to go hardware first and use numerical second. There's always trade-offs whenever you need to use numerical calculation to clean your signal. You need to acquire faster, or you need you need to acquire with a deeper. I say deep. Sorry, this is my dimension. What's the name of it? More bytes in your system. So whenever you need to acquire more signal than you need to produce a calculation, you introduce noise to your system. So I'm always going to the root. How can I clean? How can I modify my hardware system to minimize the problem to the max that I can do it? And then I further apply a numerical calculation to do the tweaking. But my first order, and I'm a hardware person, so first order hardware, second order software. Now, if you're fixed with a system that you cannot modify, well, then you have your answer. But typically with OCT, you can always add glass in you always have access to the reference arm. If you cannot rebuild and redesign the entire system, typically you have access to the reference arm, and you should be able to apply some compensation in the hardware. So my philosophy, hardware first and then software.
Yeah, I'm with you on that all the way. Yeah, get the best signal you can first. Crap in, crap out. I kind of say.
I was trying to refrain saying garbage in, garbage out, but absolutely.
But
yeah. But I think
that isn't to say to knock you know, numerical compensation and all those numerical techniques. It's just that you know, it's just not logical to try to solve the problem in software if you can first improve what you started with, right? Yeah.
But then that's in a lab where you have the luxury to say, hey, start from scratch and do your own system. And sometimes you're given a piece of hardware and you have to make the best with what you have. And in that case, you're stuck. But if you have the luxury to design de novo or add some hardware component, always that first. I'd like to emphasize something that I said. There is always a penalty to acquiring more signal to do your calculation, deeper bit rate or faster acquisition to be able to do averaging. There is always, if you look down all the sources of noises, all the sources of noise, there always is one place where because you acquired faster, or because there is a penalty. Sometimes it's negligible, but or sometimes it's small, not negligible. Sometimes it's small, but there always is a penalty. So first hardware, then software.
Right. Yeah, maybe one slight exception of that is when we went to Fourier domain OCT, you spread the signal across 1,000 detectors, and therefore you spread the noise across, you spread the noise across 1,000 detectors, and you had the signal in each individual detector, and that improves your signal to noise by a factor of 1,000. There's a small penalty to pay.
You also have 1,000 times more detector. It's not like you have the same time domain detector that, and then
it's not entirely free. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Could you, so David McMahon from Cork is asking, could you please further elaborate on how a single drop of doped glass can be stretched out into an optical fiber several stories long? And what would be the volume of the drop of glass? What is the glass doped with? How do you ensure the rod is uniform diameter? How does one extend the fiber to become several stories long, kilometers long?
I think I would refer you to YouTube videos by Corning, explaining the process. That I think they do a much better job than I could do without any props to show it to you. And I do not know what the volume is and how you ensure exactly the right process. So, but I know that if you look like Drawing Fiber, Fiber Tower and Corning, they have beautiful videos on YouTube of their foundry, and you can follow the process. And I think that would be better explanation than what I could elaborate on this morning.
Okay, very good. Would like to know, in general sense, what are the measures taken to keep the fibers used in endoscopy hygienic and dust-free, as well as to avoid dispersion? I assume this means during manufacture as opposed to during clinical use, but it could be either, I guess.
That is a good question. Oh, can you give me 1 second? I think my son unplugged my computer. Let me just replug it because we're going to lose connection.
We can still hear you and see you, so that's okay.
Give me 1 second. I have no battery left. There we go.
Oh, I see.
This is one of my favorites. My son's favorite games is going under and removing the power supply. Okay, the power is back. Yeah. So yes, it needs to be kept relatively clean, and it also once it's produced, in some companies it was a custom practice to quarantine the fibers for a little bit of time. In the work that we do, the fiber is enclosed in either a stainless steel package or into a probe that gets sterilized. And so because we put so much, the fiber is never bare within the human body, but it comes with several layers of packaging, and it's the outer layer that needs to be sterilized to go to the tissue. Do you guys still see me? I see the yeah, okay, the screen's shuffling. Super. So one rapid way to go to the clinics is to take an instrument that has been the case in the past. You take an instrument like an ultrasound, for example, catheter, and you gut it from the inside and you add your fiber optics assembly. And so if you have the approval for the outer package of the ultrasound, then de facto or very rapidly you can be approved for this OCT catheter, because you've only removed the inside and the outside hasn't changed. So you need, typically the fiber does not see the patient. It needs to be reasonably clean. You also need to keep it dust-free during the gluing, but very rapidly you insert it in a transparent packaging. Of course, the transparent packaging, being cylindrical in shape, can also introduce astigmatism as optical aberrations. So whenever you have your OCT beam going through some packaging, you need to include the packaging inside your optical design to compensate for such aberrations. But typically the fiber is not there inside the patient, it's inside the packaging, and it's a packaging that you apply sterilization methods to it.
So you're presenting tapering of fibers. Could you comment a bit on the length of the taper in relation to different wavelengths?
So the length of the taper depends on the component you're trying to make, and what we're trying to do at Castor, and that's an active area of research, is to make the taper as short as possible to be able to make shorter components, especially in view of optical lanterns, for example. But the length of the taper is only one of the parameters that we include in what is called the recipe. So for each component that we make, we have a recipe that says how much we heat it, to what degree we heat it, over what segment we fuse it, and how much we taper it. So it's part of a multi-parameter process for each particular component. So this is the recipe, and once we have it, the process is relatively controlled. It's relatively reproducible, and it can be to some extent automated as well. So the length of the taper with respect to different wavelengths really depends on what type of coupler you're trying to make. Is it a 50-50 or is it a double cut fiber coupler? But it's one of the parameters that are included in the recipe. And of course, the recipe we don't tell, unless you become a student in the lab, of course.
Okay, it's after 4 p.m. over here, and we promised people a break. So shall we take a break and come back on the half hour? So that is UK Ireland time 16:30. If you have any doubts, Google Irish time or Galway time or Dublin time, and that will reassure you, but it's about 25 minutes from now. Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you to everybody who's online asking the questions, and we'll see you back in 25 minutes. Okay, super. Bye now.
Okay. And do you know how much longer you want to do this after? So another hour after the break? Is that what you had in mind? I don't hear you, Martin. You're muted.
Sorry, I always mute in the break. So that's what we had scheduled. I guess we follow the questions. I can see that there's already a dozen questions there.
Wow.
So is that okay with you? So
perfect.
I guess we can stop at 5:30 unless we've stopped before that, right?
That sounds good. So I'm gonna fix myself a coffee and be back in 20 minutes. Do you like how this is going so far? Any comments?
It's great. Yeah, it's nice. The patient and detailed answer of questions, very much appreciated, I think. So yeah, very good.
Perfect. So I'll see you in a bit. I'll be back at 25.
Yeah, we're going to keep this live, but you can mute or whatever if you want, or even kill your screen if you want to. Well, actually, I think we're showing the logo. Anyway.
You are. Yeah, super. I wish I could offer a coffee, but yeah, it's going to be for some other time.
I'm sure it'd be much better than what we get over here, although I almost never drink coffee. Only when I'm in the south of Italy, I succumb to coffee. I'm a tea. Very old-fashioned tea.
When I visited Italy, I realized that for the first 38 years of my life, I had never really tasted coffee, and so we bought a real Italian coffee maker. I'll talk to you in a bit. Thank you, guys.
Bye now. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Aaron Crook is going to take over asking the questions, and I think Caroline is ready to go. So over to you, Aaron.
Perfect. Hi, Caroline. I think you're still muted there, actually. I can't hear you.
Hi again. There you go. Sorry.
Perfect. Excellent. So this next question comes from Washat Hassan. He says, hi, thanks for your wonderful lectures. For near-infrared spectroscopy, if we need to detect a diffused light from deep tissue non-invasively, what kind of detector should be used with fiber to detect the light from tissue, or just lens can work to focus the light into the fiber?
I'm sorry, there are a few elements in that question. Can you show me, Aaron? I'm going to read it because there are a few elements here. Is it Is it in the published or in the new? Okay, thank you. I have it
published,
here.
Yeah, the first part is for near-infrared spectroscopy. If we need to detect a diffused light from deep tissue non-invasively, what kind of detector should be used?
With fiber to detect the light from tissue. Okay, so the two approaches are, I know little about near-infrared spectroscopy, but I know that two approaches are used. One is indeed, you have a fiber lens focusing into the tissue and back assembly with a certain numerical aperture. And some people are also using multimode fiber straight in contact with the tissue. And there's not a good approach and a bad approach, but you're probing different areas in tissue, different depth and different geometries in tissue. And so what I would recommend is probably do a Monte Carlo simulation a priori to understand which depth and which zone of the tissue you're probing. Now, in terms of detector, so things to know about detector is the wavelength regime. So if you're going from 300 to 1100 nanometers, that's going to be a silicon detector. And in these type of detectors, you have pin diodes and avalanche photodiodes. That's one part. And then above, you need to use N-gas, and there are really good N-gas and some very expensive avalanche photodiodes and N-gas as well. Now, depending on how much photon volume you're expecting, a pin or an avalanche photodiode could work. If you're looking at the spectrum, then you're going to make a spectrometer, a barrette, out of these. If you're looking more at a temporal response as opposed to a spectral response, then you would probably go towards using photo multiplying tubes. These are, again, more common for visible. There are some PMTs in near infrared, but they are worth to this day more than my car. Of course, I'm not telling you what car I'm driving, but nonetheless, they're pretty expensive. Now, if you're doing spectroscopy, it depends on your wavelength regime and whether the temporal statistics is important if you're trying to recover a pulse versus if you're only looking at CW type propagation. So the photon dynamics, the wavelength, the detection scheme, spectroscopy, that is either in time domain or in the Fourier domain, and that drives which detection scheme you're using. And how our just lens can work to focus the light into the fiber. So if you decide to use a fiber optics, and it's typically very convenient if you're, for example, trying to reach the prostate or some internal organ, that's on the distal side. On the proximal side, you always need to have some ways to connect to your fiber in and out. So you'll probably, wavelength permitting, you could use a circulator that brings light from a laser to your fiber and then from the tissue through the same fiber through a third fiber. So it circulates light. So that's available at the telecom wavelength. Otherwise, you need to use a 50-50. So light is reflected and then light is transmitted. So that's a way to go in and out, or a multimode circulator. But then I don't want to talk too much about that because I'd be pitching for Castor. We just demonstrated some of the first multimode circulator at a whole variety of wavelength. So with an application directly for diffuse optical imaging and diffuse spectroscopy. But whenever you're using fiber, you need to launch light into the fiber. So you need to match the numerical aperture of the lens to the numerical aperture of the fiber, so you don't lose light on the connecting side and also on the detection side. I truly hope that answers the question. Otherwise, feel free to come back with a follow-up question.
Perfect, thanks. The next question then comes from Robert in UCL in London. He asks, could you please expand on how you tweak waveguide dispersion to balance with material dispersion in dispersion compensated fibers?
So essentially, waveguide dispersion has to do with the shape of the mode, right? So once you have the geometry of your waveguide, that the solution to the wave equation is a certain profile for the mode propagating within that waveguide. And that essentially tells you which proportion of the light travels in the core versus the inner cladding. And that gives you your waveguide dispersion. So now you can tweak the geometry of the waveguide. So it can be the shape itself. Is it like concentric circles, or do you tweak with the glasses, the glass in the core, the glass in the cladding? So you tweak with the indices of refraction and also the geometry, the diameter. But these are the parameters you can play with. But so remember, pulling your own fiber is a very costly exercise. So it's, depending on the type of fiber, it can go from $10,000 to $20,000 for a single run. So it's really rare that people will, for OCT, for example, decide to pull their own fiber. It's a costly endeavor, and it's rather a specialized endeavor. So instead, because there's a huge variety of fiber already on the market, I would try to have one that has a waveguide dispersion that match your needs.
Perfect. The next question we have is from Ashwini in Sweden. They ask, such a pleasure to listen to you. What is your approach as an entrepreneur when a relevant product doesn't meet the requirements of business model despite having clinical merits?
This is the beauty of my situation, is I can decide when I receive an idea when someone shares their idea with me, I have the editorial choice of saying, this is a product for Castor, or this is a research project for Polytechnique. So this would be a case, for example, where if it doesn't make business sense, but it makes intellectual sense, let's write a grant and let's try it at the university. Now, I have to point out, I have a second criteria for having this made at the university. Is this publishable? If it's not publishable, then we can't do it. So if it has no business merit or it's not publishable, it is not our role to do it. But typically, if it has some sort of clinical merit, if it's publishable, then at Polytechnique. If it's not, we're still going to try to find a way to do it at Castor. And the way we would go about it, if it has clinical merit and the market isn't there right away, but there is a potential for a market because it has clinical merit, then many countries have that, including Canada and including Quebec. Not Quebec being a country, but I mean regionally, you can find grants for that kind of novelty, developing novel ideas. And the reasons governments give grants like that is that if you develop a new product and you're unsure about the market, sometimes it's like the field of dreams. You build it and they will come. Sometimes as you develop a new instrument, it creates a new market, or someone else says, oh, I'm interested in this, or you learn a new way to develop products. So what happened, for example, we were asked by a single customer to create double-clad fiber couplers with the same diameters for the top, bottom, and the top fiber and the bottom fiber. And we said we can only, we were through étendu reasons, we can only achieve 50-50. But the customer said, you know, I'm willing to pay, and please try it, and please give it a try. What if you could achieve more? And it turned out we managed to achieve more, and that resulted in us changing the entire fabrication of the line of product, because we, by doing R&D on a particular project that had very little market interest except for this one customer, we develop a new way to doing things. And so typically, even in a company, you can apply for a grant if it's close to your core competency, but a little bit on the left field. So that's the beauty of having an R&D company, is that even though it doesn't make total business sense, you still have some flexibility in your profit. You should be able to free some money, combine it with the government grant to try crazy ideas. What's important, though, is that you cannot run a business where 100% or 90% of what you do are ideas like that. You need to have some, you need to have a cash cow. One of your products needs to be a cash cow to pay your employees, but also to fund research on crazy ideas that don't seem to have a market right away, but could lead to new techniques.
Very good. Thanks so much for that answer. The next one
and
we have
thanks
comes
for the compliments. I'd like to, sorry to interrupt you, Aaron, but everyone who starts their question with a compliment, I take it, right? We're not immune to that. So thank you. I appreciate the compliment.
Very good. We'll have a load of questions like that now. The next one comes from Sergey in NUIG. He asks, what about dispersion in double glad fibers in the comparison with single mode fiber?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And so we typically are in an OCT system, our double clad fiber couplers will be placed distally. So you have the whole OCT system that operates with single mode fiber, and then at the end we will have the double clad component. And so what we did is design our double clad fiber, which is fused to the single mode fiber. And so we match the core, we match the index of reflection, and we match the geometry and the numerical aperture. And so our couplers have roughly the same dispersion characteristics as the similar single mode fiber of the system. When this is not the case, if we couldn't do it, then what we could do is add a segment of double clad fiber into the reference arm to match the path exactly. But typically we can, there's still some tweak to do, but the double clad fiber is designed to match the characteristics of the single mode fiber.
Perfect. The next question in the same sort of area on the cladding, they're referring to lecture 1, just in general, how to know if the cladding has minor damage and that light is leaking into the cladding.
So cladding damage, so first of all, just take you way back to your first year of undergrad, what you should have been told in the very first lab that you do, whenever you are given a physical instrument, that's true for resistance, op-amps, fiber optics, detectors, first you need to check it, you need to evaluate it, because it could be damaged and you wouldn't know. So if you operate with fiber optics, you send power in, power out, and it should be roughly the same if you couple properly. So you account for the insertion loss, the coupling loss, but power in, power out should be roughly the same minus the coupling loss. If you don't have that, fibers are worth roughly a few cents per meter. Just discard it, take a new one, right? Now, if the second one is also damaged, maybe it's your way of measuring it that's wrong. But first, always make sure there's no damage, because that would attenuate the signal, and that's how you know. So one way to know is does it attenuate the signal? If you don't work with the full packaging with with this huge polymer outing. But even in the hydro, one way to look for damage is using a near-infrared camera, so a near-infrared viewer, and you just look at your fiber and you will see leakage occurring at a certain part. If there's a crack in the fiber, you will see leakage. So that's the same way I showed this blue fiber, right? This was scattering all over the place. But if you don't have, if your fiber is not entirely packaged over like several layers of polymer, and you only have the fiber and the hydrol, you should see the near-infrared light leaking. So that's a bad sign. But typically, because of our couplers, if we have leakage into the cladding, we will see it in the third port of the. So, for example, if I illuminate with the single mode core and I put no sample and I get some signal on the multi-mode port, that means that there was some leakage somewhere. So that's another indicator that this is broken. There shouldn't be. So learn how to read a spec sheet, because no instrument is perfect. So there is some crosstalk, but you need to measure it and make sure that your measurement falls within the specs of the instrument that you purchased and you plan to use. That's true from the smallest resistor to the largest PMT. When you get an instrument, verify it meets the specs.
Perfect. Thanks. So
I have the feeling this is not as much fiber advice, but life advice, right? If you want to be successful as an engineer, if you're dealing with an instrument, first you test your instrument. This is life advice.
Yeah.
I could be a life coach from this point on. I'm kidding.
The next question we have then is from Atta Shazari in the Netherlands. He's referring to lecture 4, slide 51, which I have here and I can bring up for everyone to see now.
It's actually a video. You won't see it if you, but it's the video of St. Jude, or am I right? Yeah, it's a video of St. Jude. Oh, you have it. Oh, it's even better. Perfect. Yep.
Perfect. So they just ask, when probing inside the artery, does the blood content distort reconstruction of the OCT images of the vessel wall?
Fantastic question, Atta. It not only distorts the OCT image, but it makes OCT impossible. Blood is opaque to light. It has a small component that absorbs, but mostly particles within blood are so scattering that coherent light doesn't hit the inner wall of the artery. So such an image, and I on purpose didn't mention it in the video. I was hoping for a question like yours. Typically, in order to be able to image through blood, you need to flush with a little bit of saline, so transparent liquid that is compatible with the human system. So of course you don't, flush with liters of water or saline water, but just a few cc's. And this, given that the artery is so small, fills a segment of the artery, and then you do your imaging within that segment. And eventually this water will be diluted in blood, and so you can do that a few times for human imaging. But blood makes the imaging, OCT imaging, completely useless. At first I thought it was the absorption, but more and more people are showing that it's a combination of absorption, yes, but mostly scattering. There's so much scattering by the cells in the blood that you don't, through Beer-Lambert, you don't have enough photons to perform ballistic imaging. I hope that helps. So yes, you're flushing. You could also have put a balloon right in the artery, and there are some instances where this has been done, but putting a balloon creates a blockage in the artery, colloquially known as a heart attack. So you try to not doing that unless you're in a completely controlled environment. But currently, I believe this is still done with flushing with saline water. And you can surprisingly, because the size of the artery is so small, you don't need a huge volume to clear the artery. But that very precise fact that you need to clear with water was one of the huge motivations to perform imaging that is very rapid, because when you had images at 2 frames or 4 frames per second, trying to coordinate the imaging with the location of the drop of water with the tip of the catheter was a little bit challenging. So if you have really rapid imaging, you flush, you can follow this drop of water, or you can image over the segment that the water occupies very rapidly. This is a good way to do it. So it was a huge motivation to do rapid imaging. Congratulations, Aaron, for pulling out this slide out of the video. That was very smart on your part. Thanks.
No bother. Thanks for that. The next one we have then comes from Kai in NUIG as well. He asks, most of your work is related to fiber optics. Fiber optics act basically like a waveguide, which brings up questions related to integrated optics. Could you comment on the challenges to integrate waveguides in solid-state materials? Where do you see challenges to align fiber optics to non-standard components like integrated optical components?
So I don't have, unfortunately, lots of experience with integrating waveguides with solid-state materials. The only work that I've done is working with MEMS devices. And so typically in the lithography, you create the grooves for the fiber, and then it's just a matter of bringing the 2 fibers. You bare the fiber, you strip it to the minimum, and in the MEMS, the lithography plate, the MEMS design, you have the grooves for the fiber. And so this is how you can make MEMS-based fiber loop and filters. So I'm assuming this would be roughly the same for the integrated optics. And I think it's a huge opportunity to, whenever you reduce the size, you reduce energy consumption. So it is, this is a very nice direction the field is taking. Unfortunately, I don't have much expertise, actually not at all in that field, but one has to be careful whenever a new technology arrives. I remember when I was much younger, I was more in radiology than in optics. And my first 2 years in MRI, I was so fascinated by MRI. And I asked my supervisor, but I was very naive. I still am naive, but I was more naive then. And I said, why are other techniques still existing, right? There's so much we can do with MRI. And then he said, well, you know, a new technology never completely, well, very rarely does a new technology arrives and sweeps everything else before it. So there are still areas where entirely photonics, entirely fiber optics will work. Some areas where entirely integrated optics will work, and some areas, a combination of the two. In the MEMS world, the grooves for the grooves for the fiber optics are integrated in the design, and so I'm assuming something very similar could be done. Now, in that case, the broad assumption that the field going out of the fiber optics is just like the paraxial approximation, and you know, approximating this as a Gaussian beam propagation approximation doesn't work, then you're working not far, but near field. And so now all these other calculations need to be made, working with the field directly. But this is part of the challenge, but this is yeah, a very good opportunity, and I'm assuming this is how the integration is being done.
Thank you. The next question we have comes from Matassim. He asks, is V defined after designing the fiber, or is it a controllable factor in the design/making process?
It should be no. It's you're designing it, and so V depends on the NA and the diameter, right? So NA of the core, NA of the inner cladding, and the diameter, and so essentially you can always tweak one versus the other to reach single mode for a particular wavelength. However, you are right that sometimes manufacturers they measure it afterwards. Sometimes it's a little sloppy. So they can say, for example, we have a cutoff wavelength that is roughly this, but sometimes the cutoff wavelength varies a little bit. So sometimes it's measured after, but it should be a design process. You're always aiming for, when you design the fiber, you're aiming you're designing it for the fiber to be single mode at a certain wavelength. And what happened in the past, and this is in the past, 1310 was the telecom wavelength, and so to be on the safe side, the fiber was single mode up to 1280 and 1275. And the OCT community had been a little lazy in the sense that they said, oh, we're centered at 1310, and then not thinking, they're like, oh, let's take a fiber that's single mode at 1310. But OCT has a huge bandwidth. And so most OCT systems were actually single mode, but not for the beginning of the spectrum. So what we did at Castor is we repulled fibers that for them to have the cutoff closer to 1250, 1240, 1230 to make sure that they were single mode for the entire spectrum. So you design it with a certain V in mind. After it's being pulled, then you measure it. But it sometimes, if you're always off, then you should redesign your fiber or pull it a little more as well. So you have this huge preform, and the more you can pull it with certain velocities that will yield a different diameter. And so you can, with the same preform, change your pulling parameters to vary a little bit with keeping the ratio, the NA constant, changing the diameter. So you always need to measure it afterwards, but you clearly design a fiber to be single mode with a certain regime.
Thanks so much. The next question then asks, how much do microcracks affect the signal? And how can it be ensured that the fiber is deteriorated and no longer good for use?
So essentially, the macro band, you see it right away. You're in the lab, you bend the fiber, you lose signal. The micro bending will happen after time as micro cracks propagate and eventually deteriorate the fiber. So this will happen typically when you're packaging. So people will use tie wrap and they will, squeeze the fiber, and so that works today, you're doing it, but a few months down the road, then suddenly your signal attenuates. So I think there's plenty of online, there are plenty of good practice for fiber optics. Don't treat fiber optics as a copper cable. So first thing, and try to know about what the bending radius is, because even on day one, if you're very close to the bending radius or a little close, smaller, sometimes on day one you won't see it, but it's down the road. So I guess what I was saying is more of a warning sign. So be aware that there's a bending radius. Be aware that some effects will happen down the road, and so make sure it doesn't happen. So whenever you're ready with your system, look at all your components and measure the radius of curvature. And if it's too tight, then loosening up and make sure with tape you tie the fiber, you put the fiber on their substrate such that it's not too tight. So warning number one. Warning number two, when suddenly you lose visibility of your OCT interferogram, two culprits: the laser, the fiber. So good practice, power in, power out. What's my attenuation? And how is my attenuation changing over time? And unfortunately, these animals, they're not static. They will degrade over time, but sometimes your clinical study is over several months. And I don't know, for some reason, the second that this instrument leaves the lab, people stop thinking. You need to be an engineer every single day. So good practice before a clinical session. Power in, power out. What's the visibility of my interferogram? Hasn't changed. And if it hasn't, the system is clear to go to the clinic. So in my younger years, I was doing clinical work on Friday, Sunday night, on Friday all day. And so Thursday night, I would spend my evenings in the lab just measuring everything to make sure that a new sample saw the same system week on. And that's just good practice. But for some reason, sometimes as engineers, the minute this instrument leaves the lab, we're like, oh, we That's it, we stop thinking. So we need to treat it as a physical instrument that can and will degrade over time. And when this happens, 2 culprits, 3 culprits, the standard dust on the optics, right? Laser not behaving, and fiber optics being degraded over time. Fiber optics are cheap, and so people, because of that, tend to not pay so much attention because they are so cheap. But what's expensive is the hour you put into to change your system. So try to be mindful of that. When you when you put 2 butt couplers, don't tighten them too much because they will scratch with one another. You will increase the stress on the edges. So just try to learn about the good practice for optical fibers. If you find no one in your lab, just Google it. You know, what are good practices for fiber optics? So couplers, bending. Same when you put into a polarization controller, the little black one, don't squeeze too much on all of those. So if you think of that, then down the road you'll be. But I've had optical systems that have been good for years on, but you just need to be very delicate and mindful.
That's some very good advice. Thanks. The next question we have is, how is light collection from the sample side effectively performed when OCT is used with an endoscope?
So it's no different. It's just that the probes that I showed are so miniaturized that we don't see the individual parts. So let me try to draw this for you. And if this were a real class, I would have a whiteboard, but bear with me for a second. So in a standard system, that you have your fiber optics, and then you have some sort of a collimator. So it's a lens that collimates light. And then you have some black box that does the scanning. I'll show this to you in a minute, along with the dragons that I draw to my son. That's a different story. And then you have some lens that focuses this beam And Aaron, please tell me if that makes sense, or if you see, or if this is so. Typically, this is how you would have an OCT, a free space OCT system. Do you see anything?
Yeah, no, we see that.
Okay,
that's good.
So you have the fiber, some collimating instrument, so right, a lens, a black box that is a 2D scanner or whatever you put there, some focusing instrument, the tissue, and then you focus into the tissue. Now the question is, how is the light collection if you are an endoscope? So it's just that you wouldn't see the difference, because in an endoscope we tend to have monolithic instruments. So you're gonna have this, you can have this. I don't even know, like, yeah, okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, this is on the spot, so I'm trying to not make a fool of myself, but okay. So it's all glued together, but it's exactly the same, essentially. So you have a fiber, then out of the fiber you put a spacer. What is it? If you want to keep the fiber dimension, you could put a core-less fiber. So it's essentially just a fiber that has no core, only one zone, and it acts as an expander, right? This is where the beam expands. Then you put a Grin lens or a Grin fiber, and you make the length according to its pitch. So it starts from diverging, it converts essentially diverging light into converging light. And if you want to look at the side to have this helicoidal probe, you put a prism, which through total internal reflection will redirect the beam outside, right? And so now I'm going to draw the tissue. So the tissue is here. right? And so you're, by rotating the probe and by pulling it back, you get the image that we showed earlier in slide 51, right? So you have the tissue, the light goes into the tissue, and light that is coming back in the ballistic fashion at 180 degrees is collected with the same numerical aperture back into the fiber, and you're collecting it either with a 50-50 or a circulator. And so you rotate the probe and you pull it back and you get your 3D image. Now, since we're at it, and because I'm not a rookie mom anymore, I also have markers on my desk. Not everything can be my son's fault. Sometimes it's thanks to him that I have. We also have the double clad part here, right? That will collect multiply scattered photons. And now the blue part was the core of the fiber, but I have now the red part, which is the multimode inner cladding, that not only collect the singly scattered photon, but also some multiply scattered photons for diffuse imaging that I can use as my added contrast. Aaron, again, you're my guide. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, no, we can see that perfect. That's all good.
Super. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. So what is left, what is missing in this view? Of course, all the length, all the length, all the tissue, the composition, the glass composition. Where do you put tilted interfaces? What kind of glue do you use? Right? Where do you prevent your backscattering from occurring? Which one are the polished edges? And so the devil is in the detail, and this is what the community is working. So this seems simple to make an endoscope, and in fact it is. Making an endoscope is simple. Making a good endoscope in a way that is manufacturable at very high volumes with as little human input as possible, that's a different proposition. But as a grad student in a class, for example, making a side viewing OCT endoscope is easy-ish. Making a good one is hard. Again, that's another life truth that I'm just saying. Is that this is me, the Professor Boudoux life coach.
Very good. Thanks for the drawings.
The hardest part about these is that sometimes, and maybe I delude myself, but sometimes I get people laughing, and here I have like no feedback from you guys. So if there's a chat where you can just find a visual way to laugh, that would be lovely. Other than that, I'm doing just fine here. Sorry. Aaron, back to you.
No, you're good. You're good. Thanks for the drawings. They're very, very good. The next one we have then is from Ashwini again in Sweden. They ask how a hyperspectral data cube is correlated with OCT data by eliminating shadow effects and depth scaling issues at the layer-specific boundaries in the tissue.
Haha. When I'm telling you that students are the star, I'm not kidding. So this is me in the lab saying, hey, how about we use a double-clad coupler for combining OCT with hyperspectral imaging? And to me, the work is done. I throw my idea and poof. And thankfully, my students are much better than I am, because I have no idea how to really make it happen, but they figure it out. So essentially, for hyperspectral imaging, we are in the visible spectrum, because this is where you have the fingerprint region and you have the most absorption spectra, most absorption by tissue. And this is how this differential absorption by different chromophores creates your color, your image, your oxygenation map, or your, looking for a word here, the inflammation map. OCT is in the near infrared. So in order to do hyperspectral and OCT, we have two different collection schemes. The single mode goes to OCT. In this case, it's a swept source system, but it could be a spectral domain system. So you have the near infrared detection. And in the case of hyperspectral, we have a spectrometer or we also work in the Fourier domain. Sometimes we work in the multispectral regime. So we find 4 wavelengths and we modulate each of the wavelengths with a different frequency such that the same detector picks all 4 wavelengths. And by Fourier transform, we can tell which wavelength was attenuated or not. But then how do you make a really cute image that I showed with the leaf or the skin, for example? It takes tons of work. So first, we assume that the hyperspectral data is a maximum intensity projection of this entire column onto this one plane. So now, for every 3D data set for OCT, we create a 2D map only for hyperspectral imaging or multispectral imaging. Then in the OCT image, my student performs in a segmentation of the tissue surface, removes all the noise that's above, and creates this 3-dimensional image of OCT. And on the top, where he segmented his image and he established the beginning of the sample, then comes and attach this color to this pixel. So there's image reconstruction that involves first creating the multispectral versus hyperspectral map, and using the hyperspectral data cube to highlight the chromophore you're looking for, either for oxygenation map or for inflammation or for true white color. Then, so there's a lot of calculation to make sure that the white color is a true white color, and there's a whole paper on just the colorimetry of that. But then he also performs segmentation in his data cube to find the surface, and then go assemble the hyperspectral versus multispectral onto the OCT. I hope this answers the question.
That's good. I think.
But there is no depth information from the hyperspectral imaging. We assume that all the information we get is from a column at this XY location, but we don't have Z information about hyperspectral imaging from hyperspectral imaging.
Perfect. The next question we have is in reference to a slide again, so I can bring that up first. So there we go. So it's from Ashwini in Sweden again, and they are asking partial coherent detection while using double-clad fiber coupler. If the maximum efficiency at the BW port 1 to 3 wasn't achieved, how would it affect the detective image? Would it appear as depth artifacts or contrast variation?
So a good question. If you don't have the maximum extraction from the inner cladding of port 2 to port 3, you would have a dimmer image to a certain point. When you're working with reflectance data, sometimes a dimmer image falls under the threshold of no image at all. So you need to have there's a minimum that you need to reach in order to get some sort of imaging. So that part of the answer, if you have a weak efficiency between port 2 and port 3, you have a dimmer image. However, the first part of your question, so if now from port 1 to port 2, if you have some leakage, if at the fused section, for example, you lose some light from the core into the inner cladding, the best case scenario, it means that you will lose visibility of the fringes, right? The contrast in your OCT interferogram, because one of the 2 arms is lower than it should be. So again, you lose SNR in your OCT image. So that's your best case scenario. What could also happen is the single mode light, when it leaks into the cladding, it keeps propagating along the core and could, at the interface at port 2, reintegrate the core. But now, of course, this light has not followed the same path as going to the sample and back, but is being reflected at the end of the coupler and being detected. And when this happens, you're creating essentially another image, an artifact at a different depth. So what we're doing essentially is to make sure that these sites where reflections could occur, so reflection and reintegration of light that was propagating in the clad and now going back into the fiber, they occur at distances that are long enough such that a ghost image is not just almost overlapping with the image, but the ghost image is outside of the visualization range. And so that's one way to bypass that. But the first, you work on your hardware and you try to create a coupler that is as clean as possible. And then hardware first. And then in a second iteration, once you say, okay, there's nothing, I have no more ideas, this is it, I cannot work on the coupler anymore, or the coupler has reached theoretical limit in terms of what its potential is, then you work on making the fiber segments long enough such that the ghosts are occurring as you make the segment long, the ghost is leaving your image, and the ghost is not in your image anymore. And there's a great paper by Kathy Baudet from my group where she essentially discusses the ghosts in OCT.
Very good, thank you. Thanks. The next question we have comes from Izao. He says, thanks, Professor Boudoux. I'm curious why fiber coupler always has a very limited wavelength range. What are the main technical challenges?
So the theory of making a coupler is that you take two fibers, right, that each have a core, for example. So to a single mode, let's just discuss the single mode fiber coupler. And first mechanically you put them together, so now they're side by side. And when you heat it and you melt, you fuse together a certain range. So that's your fusion range, you fuse it together and then you taper it. What happens as you fuse them together is that you bring the two cores very close enough that as opposed to being seen by light as being two different structures, each having their fundamental mode, is you've brought them so close together that the structure now defines what is called a super mode. And the super mode is beating. And if you let this over the fused section, you have propagation of the super mode, and as it's beating, it essentially exchanges power between one fiber and the next. And if you choose your length carefully enough, you can stop the fused section at the ratio of energy when energy is, for example, 99:1, 50:50, 75:25. But this is done through beating of the super mode. The super mode depends on what? Depends on the geometry of the cross section of the two fibers, the two fused fibers, so the geometry of the cross section, but it is also, as we said in the V parameter, depending on the wavelength. So now the shape of the super mode and the propagation vector of the super mode depends on the wavelength. And so typically, fiber couplers that are spec'd for 50-50 will still work at different wavelength range, but if you're outside of the specs, you will have a different ratio of power going up versus power going down. And this is describing a very simple structure. So now, because it's beating, everything is periodical, so you can think, if you're trying to make it as broadband as possible, you need to find the multiple of, you need to find the length for which all of the wavelength are at the ratio you're looking for. So because it's periodical, there's always the multiple that you can find to achieve this. Aaron, was that clear enough, or were you trying to find the slide number? I hope I hope this was clear. Otherwise, do follow up with a question.
Oh no, that was perfectly clear. I was just getting ready for our next question. It's from
Perfect. No, I'm saying to the student, if this wasn't clear for the student, because there's lots of physics for the hands here, do come back with a question. Thank you.
Perfect. The next question we have here is from Atta Shazari, again in the Netherlands. He asks, in this slide in lecture 4, can inflation of the balloon inside an organ be hazardous for the patients, for instance, by occluding an organ?
It could, right? So if you think in the heart, blocking the blood flow temporarily by the balloon is the equivalent of having a small heart attack, right? So for every organ, this needs to be considered. And so, of course, you're never allowed to do clinical imaging without submitting your entire protocol to an ethics committee who works with you into balancing, is there more good to be gained by the patient than the harm being done to the patient? And this is exactly what RRBs and internal review boards and ethics committee are doing. So the idea of an ethics committee is never to say no, 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 no at all costs, but rather is to weigh the benefits for the patients versus the potential harm being done.
Perfect. I'll stop sharing that now. The next question we have then comes from Sylvain in Ivory Coast, and they ask, for laser sources which provide coherent illumination, can speckle noise be suppressed by using an appropriate type of optical fiber? If yes, 1, how does it work? And then 2, is the light at the output of the fiber still coherent or partially coherent? So the first one, I guess, then, can you do it?
Absolutely. I'm trying not to do too much physics with my hands, so I'm going to refer you to a slide number, but I might have deleted it for time. Let me see. And so in lecture 5 and 6, Aaron, if you manage to go to pull slide number 4.
Perfect. 2 seconds now. I'll find that.
All right.
Sorry, slide 4 in that, is it? They start on
lectures 5 and 6.
They start on 47, so there's four slides in.
4 slides in, yeah.
Oh, perfect. 1 second then.
Wow, that's quite the technical service here. Thank you so much.
No
So,
bother. Sorry, it's just taking a second. I'll let you start answering, and I'll bring it up in 2 seconds.
And by the way, I'm so excited to talk to someone in Ivory Coast. So this shows how healthy the field is when so many people are working or are interested in it. Oh no, this is are you getting there? So very, very early, but I think this is lecture 4. I'm just looking at lecture 5 and 6. So I'll start answering. So go back to your question. Okay, for laser source which provide coherent illumination, can speckle noise be suppressed by using an appropriate type of optical fiber? Absolutely. So this is exactly what we are doing with the double clad fiber. In A, you have a cross section of the double clad fiber, and in B, just to test your orientation skills, we show it in the other direction. And for fun fact, I was working in a very diverse a lab with people from all over the world, and so for me it's very natural to have figures that you read from left to right. But I was working with a postdoc that writes figure from right to left, and there are a couple. I realized that only afterwards, after the fact, but there are a couple of figures from my thesis that are read from right to left because of working with that postdoc. Anyways, so in A of the right figure, you see a 3D rendering or 3D sketch of a single mode fiber, with the yellow being the core and B being the double clad fiber with the core in yellow and the multi-mode inner cladding in orange. In A, it's just a cross section of the same concept. So you see the very small single mode fiber core, and in dark gray, the very large multimode inner cladding. So what happens, there are several ways to think of it, but what happens when you have single mode illumination and single mode detection is that you're fully coherent. You start with a wavefront, right, that is very regular and that provides us diffraction limited spot onto the sample. And if you have ballistic minus 180 degree backscattering, this sample, the projection of the scattering, the projection of the field emitted by that scatterer excites the single mode of the fiber, and it's propagated to your detector. If you have if you have a turbid sample, the wavefront becomes rapidly irregular. And when you image with even if you excite with a single mode fiber with a very perfect spherical wavefront, the tissue will distort the wavefront, and the backscattered light will not be spherical anymore, but will have many different orientations. Its K-space is much larger. Going back, what happens is that this wavefront will be decomposed into the orthogonal modes of the multimode fiber. And depending on the integral overlap of this troubled wavefront onto the different modes, you will excite some modes more than others. Each of these modes, as they propagate through the fiber optics, will propagate at different velocities and accumulate different phase. But once you detect them at a detector, essentially what you do is you take a time average of those modes and you scramble the phase such that the variation from the speckle, from the location of all the scatterers that created all these phases, will be washed away by this ensemble average over all these modes. So this is one strategy to remove speckle and still keep your resolution. You have diffraction limited illumination, the tissue being turbid, it excites many modes. The propagation of those modes is done at different velocities and phases, and as you detect them, there's an average that essentially scrambles the phase, and this is how you mitigate the effect of the scatter location creating the speckle. So it's not an easy concept, but I hope my hand explanation helps it a little bit. So technically speaking, your illumination is coherent. Detection with the single mode part, because the single mode is still there, so you can illuminate and collect. So illumination and detection with a single mode fiber is fully coherent imaging. But once you open the pinhole and use multimode for collection, then your imaging becomes partially coherent. And if you had done imaging with a multimode fiber in and multimode fiber out, this would be incoherent, also called diffuse imaging. I hope this helped, and thanks for pulling up this slide, Aaron.
No problem. Perfect. The next question we have then comes from Harsha in India. They say, thank you for your wonderful lectures. Just out of curiosity, are fiber optic techniques used at present to detect or diagnose coronavirus in affected areas?
I can name one instance. So one of the problems with coronavirus, well, there's so many, but one of them is the test being done with the écouvillon, with the swab. It's very uncomfortable, and it also takes several hours because you need the reagent to extract the virus from the swab, but also to make the process happen. So I know of a few research groups trying to come up with Raman imaging to get a faster diagnostic turnaround. Of course, now here fiber optics could be used within the making of the Raman microscope, but we will not send fiber optics up people's nose or in their throat. What instead would be done is create an entire system, the Raman microscope, packaged in a box that you would send, for example, in the pharmacy, the same idea where you take your pressure, for example, and then at the pharmacy, in a controlled manner, you could provide a saliva sample that you put within a cuvette within your Raman microscope for instantaneous diagnostics. And this is currently under investigation by many groups in the world, including that of Professor Leblanc in Montreal. There is, however, again, not about fiber optics, but biophotonics is involved in the fight against coronavirus. Professor Armani in Southern California, myself in Montreal, and a few groups around the world, when there was a shortage of personal protective equipment, we were working on strategies to use UV light to disinfect N95 masks because there was a huge shortage of those masks. And many groups have shown that this can be done in the context where there is a shortage of those masks. So the idea would be at the break, the PPE would be zapped and people after their break would put them back on. It would not be necessarily as good as if the mask were new, but it certainly is much better than wearing the same mask all day or in successive days because there's a shortage of those masks. So biomedical optics is playing a role in the fight for COVID. Fiber optics maybe in the design of instruments, but I think at this point we're looking for a point of care. We're looking for large systems that would be deployed in pharmacy or centralized areas. But I probably wouldn't have a fiber optics up my nose at the moment. I think having a saliva sample is the route that people have chosen to take. It's a very relevant question. I know if you're, I don't know if you know this conference called SPIE Photonics West. It will be, we're still debating whether it's going to be live or remote this year, but if it is remote, you will have access to it for very little money if it is remote. And there's a track, so there's a hashtag COVID-19 in this conference where you can follow all the breakthrough science that was performed during the year.
Very good, and thanks for that information on Photonics West. The next question we have then comes from Robert in UCL in London again. He asks, what kind of materials are used in the packing of optical fiber probes, e.g. the 9-point Envision VLE OCT probe shown in the lecture slide we saw previously? And what considerations should you make when choosing material and designing for optical fiber probe packaging? And then a very important question at the end, which we'll come back to afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you. How do you choose a material? So I don't know precisely which polymer is used for the Envision VLE OCT probe, but several considerations. First of all, always mind the radius of curvature of your sheath. Because it will induce astigmatism. It's the equivalent of adding a cylindrical lens to your system. So you need to compensate for this astigmatism ahead of time. The medium has to be transparent, not for visible, but transparent at the wavelength of interest. You also need to look at the polymer that it doesn't have any micro bubbles, because at these scales, a micro bubble acts as a lens, a micro lens within your sheath, and so that will aberrate your wavefront. So considerations: radius, the transmission, astigmatism, and the purity of the material. And it also needs to be compliant with the different sterilization measures. So there are many ways to sterilize optical instruments, and there's one thing to sterilize an instrument that's going to be used in a research trial on 15 patients, and it's a different proposition to sterilize an instrument where you deploy thousands of units across different hospitals. So at different strategies, you need to talk with biomedical engineering at your school, at your university, at your hospital, to find the compatibility of certain polymer for different types of sterilization. This is tabulated, you can find it, but you also need to verify from an optics point of view that it doesn't have any bubbles in it. Second question from Robert. Do you want to read it, Aaron?
Yeah, it's an important question asked a couple of times. Why do you relate confocal microscopy to the 2001 film A Space Odyssey?
So it turns out that 2001: A Space Odyssey is about is a sci-fi movie exploiting artificial intelligence. So AI is really much at the core of the movie. And at the time, AI was at this very early days, and it's really rare to have a scientist that is known for creating both fields, but it happens in confocal microscopy. The inventor of confocal microscopy is Marvin Minsky, but in the AI community is also recognized as being one of the fathers of artificial intelligence. And it was so much so that in the making of 2001: A Space Odyssey, he acted as a consultant for the script to make sure that things that were said were scientifically relevant. But not only that, in honor of him being the founder of the field, the main character, Victor Kaminsky, is actually named after Minsky. And so Minsky is the inventor of confocal microscopy, but also one of the founding fathers of AI.
Very good. Thanks so much. The next
we
question
have this, if I may, Aaron, we have this saying in French, and I don't know, I'll translate it in English. I don't know if you have it, but in French, we say that culture is like jam. The least you have it, the more you feel the need to spread it. And so here, when I spread this little culture like so thinly, you've reached the extent of my my movie culture, certainly.
Very good. I haven't heard that expression before, but it's very good. The next one we have is from Gary in Rochester in New York. He asks, thank you for your lectures. All your applications are fascinating. Regarding laser injection with your probes, how hard is it to control for tissue damage? Is it easy to predict / model damage thresholds, or is it mostly determined experimentally?
We do a healthy combination of both. But the first work by Cathy Baudet, she used Monte Carlo simulations that she fed into a heat transfer model. And so you can, I wouldn't say easily, but you can model it and surprisingly match your model with experimental work. And so I was actually pleasantly surprised to see how accurate your modeling can be. Of course, we never take anything for granted. So in the first work that we did with Cathy and also with Raphael, we validated everything with histopathology. So we did it on tissue. We recorded the temperature of the tissue. So if it's not a living, if it's ex vivo, it's not at 37 degrees anymore centigrade, but it's at 25 or room temperature, and that makes a difference. So even those 12 degrees do make a difference. But I was pleasantly surprised that the modeling can be performed and arrive at really accurate predictions. But experimentally, we also validate everything we do with histopathology. And both Raphael and Cathy, in both their respective theses, had reasonably good modeling versus results, correspondence between the two. I'd like to point you to, I don't think I have it here. Most of my books are in my office, and I haven't been to Polytechnique since March. but there's a fantastic book by Welsh, edited by Welsh, but it has like a plethora of authors about the laser tissue interactions in terms and the heat transfer and heat effect. And so I highly recommend this book. You have tables of data, but also the combination of heat transfer and optical propagation through Monte Carlo is really, really well explained. I'm sorry. Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay, you're still there.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Sorry, so the next question we have, just the last couple for this session that we can ask then, is another NIRS/diffuse optics question. We typically detect diffuse light with a large fiber bundle, roughly 5 mils in diameter, in contact with the tissue. Is there an efficient way to focus the light from the large fiber bundle into a smaller multimode fiber that's about 600 micrometers in diameter for delivery to a detector? No need to worry about coherence or fast temporal characteristics of the light. Thanks.
I'm reading. Let me just understand. Okay. So it seems to me to be a question of étendue. So étendue is one of the quantities that is preserved in optics. So it relates the angular spread to the geometrical spread. In fiber optics, it's the product of the area with the numerical aperture. And so I'm not sure I see the question that you're asking, but my answer for me would be to, as long as you're not trying to not conserve étendue, you should be able. So take into account your fiber bundle, the area you're trying to map, and the numerical aperture of your fiber bundle. And you can use a lens system to map that into the area and the numerical aperture of the multimode system, provided that there isn't such a large étendue gap between the two.
Perfect. Thanks so much. The next one we have comes from Kolkata. They ask, what effect does double cladding have on the bending radius of the fiber as compared to similar single cladding fiber?
Well, surprisingly, not so much. So if we look at a single mode fiber versus a double clad fiber, and of course it's not to scale, but I'm going to try my best here. So I'm also going to try to draw this. And you could totally see why my career as an arts person didn't work. For that and so many other reasons, but terrible. So single mode, okay. Single mode here, multi-mode here, that's a cross section. So 125 and 10 micron, 125, 10 micron, and 105. So I also have the index profile here. Essentially, you could see the double clad fiber as being a single mode fiber where you doped the outside ring. And in some instances, this is how they are made, right? So this is just mechanically, it's a single mode fiber that was doped on the outer rim, and so mechanically it has essentially the same properties. And this is also super helpful to model when you think of it as being the same animal, but just one of them has ions, not ions, but add diffusion on the outside, dopant on the outside.
Very good. And the last question then we have for the session comes from David McMahon down in Cork in Ireland. And he asks, is dispersion linear with respect to wavelength difference? I'm just wondering how one source of dispersion can match with a second source of dispersion.
picosecond per nanometer times kilometer. I am not sure how to answer that question. What I would do is I would probably use. I'm to be honest, I'm not sure. So what I would do is I would take your two dispersion curves, numerically plot them, and try to find conditions for them to be opposite to one another. But a priori, I'm gonna say I'm not sure by wavelength difference if you mean the central wavelength versus the width of the pulse. And I truly do not know how to answer your question. But if I would probably just numerically solve it and try to find a regime for which one can cancel the other. I'm sorry, Aaron, this is as good as it goes for this answer. No,
that's perfect. That's excellent. I think that's where we've finished now. Our next session is in just over 10 minutes with Brian, so we'll have to get ready for him too. But I'll pass on to Martin.
All right, so thank you so much to Caroline. That was quite a mammoth session. We still had some questions left over. Let's see what we do with those. So sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but thank you so much, Caroline. It's been a pleasure. Your day is beginning. We still have another session with Brian Wilson, and wow. I'm beginning to realize that accidentally I've ended up with quite a lot of Canadians on this session. Right? I think Laura is also from Canada originally. Is that correct? And Brian Pogue? Laura Waller.
Brian is from Canada, but I don't know about Laura.
Yeah. So excellent. So we will leave it there. Thank you so much on behalf of the students and myself, and to everybody else. We will see you on the other session with Brian Wilson shortly. Thanks, Caroline. Bye now.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions.